Welcome to this session on React Native versus Flutter. In this session, we would look at identifying some of the differences between the React Native and Flutter frameworks. Let's start with understanding the core areas of comparison as part of this session. We will be looking at key aspects to identify differences between both the frameworks, predominantly on the language front, the UI aspect, the performance, the documentation, the popularity, the community support that is available for both these frameworks, along with the industry trends in terms of the industry adoption for both these platforms. The core objective of the session would be that at the end, you should be able to decide and make an informed decision as to which framework is the best among those available. Let's start from a language perspective. Now, if you look at React is basically completely written and built in JavaScript using the React.js API. On the other hand, if you look at Flutter, it is basically written in a very new language called as Dart, and we do not have too many developers that are skilled on Dart. However, every browser and every platform being shipped with an inbuilt JavaScript execution environment, that makes JavaScript platform and a language of choice for developers. So every browser today or every browser manufacturer would have inbuilt support for executing JavaScript programs. Similarly, most popular platforms, mobility platforms like Android and iOS, have default support for executing JavaScript programs. And that's the reason when you compare this with Flutter, Flutter uses Dart, which is predominantly a newer language, and you really do not have too many developers who are skilled on this. So that really is the selling point and the USP of React Native, because when you work with React Native, you really do not have to relearn a lot. You don't have a sharp learning curve. Most of the JavaScript developers who are working with MeanStack, already working with HTML, CSS, and DHTML can easily align to this. Dart, as we have discussed, is pretty new in the industry and would not have that much of penetration in the developer community. From a UI perspective, when you talk about React Native, it's based pretty much on native components for the Android and the iOS platform. And Flutter, on the other hand, uses a very proprietary set of widgets, and it has its own page structure that needs to be set up. So it's a closed ecosystem as compared to an open ecosystem in React Native, which allows you to go and implement third-party widgets and UI frameworks as well. Now, this is really what allows you to pick and choose with React Native, because you can go and decide whether you want to use Kendo UI or a set of delivery controls, or any other third-party UI framework can be implemented. But for Flutter, you have a pretty closed ecosystem, and that's the reason the UI components that are available out of the box and built into the platform are all that you can use. From a performance perspective, when you talk about React Native, it basically is built and uses JavaScript out of the box, and that's the reason when you want to write any code in JavaScript that connects and tries to access native services on that specific platform, it uses a bridge to do that. But when you're using Flutter, on the other hand, Flutter does not need any kind of bridge. So there's no concept of you write Flutter code and then it uses a bridge to go and connect to the native set of components to interact with. And this is what really impacts the speed and the performance aspect of developing and executing applications between both these frameworks. Because if you look at React, the speed of development is a little bit slower when you compare that with Flutter. And that's because it has an intermediate bridge that it has to communicate with, and every layer of additional communication and computation that you put in between two tiers in an application that you build obviously would have a performance impact. From a documentation perspective, if we were to compare, Flutter typically has a very well-defined documentation repository, and it allows developers to go through it in a very simple manner. So it's all structured, it's all organized. Unlike what you see on React Native, because in React Native, it actually, since React Native is an open ecosystem, it allows you to implement third-party widgets, and you can do a lot of configuration and plug and play. And that's the reason the documentation also is not very strong, well organized, and impactful. And that's the reason most developers would find it a little challenging to go through the React Native documentation when you compare that to the documentation available in terms of Flutter. Popularity is always a key when working with platforms, and that should be a crucial decision maker, because when it comes to open source technologies and you're stuck somewhere, you obviously go to the community to go and find out how best you can solution the problem. Now, Flutter being relatively a new entrant into the market, it does not have a lot of developer penetration, and that's the reason the popularity in the community is not very strong. React Native being there for a while now, it's been around for some time, and that's the reason it's pretty popular among developers. Also, since it uses JavaScript, it's a natural transition and a progression path for those who are working with HTML5, CSS, and are building web applications, or have been building hybrid mobile apps. Find it very easy to migrate to this, because Flutter requires you to learn a new programming language, which is Dart. And that is one more reason why the popularity of this is much, much better on the React Native front as compared to Flutter. Again, if you look at Google Trends, you could actually look at both of the lines here. The red line indicating Flutter, it started on a very positive note, and then there was a plateau, and then suddenly a spike. React Native has been much more steady in terms of its growth, and ultimately, if you look at it now, both of them seem to be trending at par with each other. So the community support, as we were speaking about, if you look at Stack Overflow, which is one of the most popular websites to go for any kind of developer trends and movements, and for a Q&A that most developers would have, you can actually look at the number of questions here. And also React Native is part of GitHub, as it's open source. It was released in 2015, and it's because of the huge community support that it becomes easier to implement this. You have a lot of confidence as a developer when you start building on this stack, because if you're stuck somewhere, you will have a lot of help available on the way. On the other hand, if you compare that with Flutter, you can look at the question count here on Stack Overflow. And this being a new entrant in the market, it has a smaller footprint on the community aspect, but of course, that keeps increasing every day. Again, from a React Native perspective, and you talk about stability in terms of stable releases, there again, you would see that React Native does a much better job as compared to Flutter. So the industry trends are something which all of us have to be aware of, specifically if we would need to make a decision in terms of our careers, the technology that we are learning, what is the growth aspect, what is the industry adoption, and how we could really move ahead on our career graphs in terms of the opportunities market, the job market, etc. So again, getting back to Stack Overflow, which is the benchmark for understanding technology trends in IT sphere and on software development. If you look at a recent survey conducted in 2019, 62.5% of developers seem to have shown interest in React Native, as compared to a marginal rise of 65.4%, where Flutter seems to be doing much better. And of course, that could be due to the time frames that both these technologies have been around. React has been around for quite a while, and hence the job prospects are much better. A lot of organizations implementing this. Flutter has been a new entrant, and hence slightly fewer opportunities, as the penetration still needs to happen in the opportunities job market and from a developer skills perspective. So these are some of the big names that are using React Native in their implementations, right from Facebook to Pinterest to Wix, Skype, Tesla, Insta, Bloomberg. You can actually look at the implementation across industry, which is absolutely crucial when you're learning something new, because when you want to join a large logo, obviously, if there are a lot of logos using this, that enhances the credibility of what you're learning, puts a justification to why you would want to learn this technology. Flutter, on the other hand, associated with big names like Google, Sonos, Alibaba, the largest retailer out there. From a conclusion perspective, if we were to conclude on what we've discussed from a language perspective, obviously we said React is much more popular since it is a natural progression for developers to work on JavaScript and then move to this, as compared to Dart, which is relatively a new language. From a UI perspective, the open source plug and play capability of configuring and adopting seamlessly to newer platforms of widgets and third-party UI platforms are much better as compared to Flutter, which is a closed ecosystem and depends on inbuilt widgets to implement. The performance aspect we discussed because of the bridge from the code that you write to the native component access exists in React and is isolated and not any longer required in Flutter, and hence the performance is impacted because of the additional layer in between. The documentation much better in Flutter because it's a closed ecosystem and they can control what you can use. React Native being open-ended, it really has a lot of third-party integration you can do, and hence the documentation is not really well organized. The popularity perspective, React Native much more popular among HTML5, CSS3, MERN, mean stack developers, since it's all JavaScript. Flutter needs you to learn new skills and you need to spend additional time for that. From a community support, React Native has been there for a longer time as compared to Flutter, and hence has a stronger community support as compared to Flutter. And that translates into better job prospects in the industry for React Native as compared to Flutter. So if we were to give it a score, React scores much better with a total score of 5, leaving Flutter with a total score of 2. So I hope we were able to understand the differences between the React Native and Flutter, and this will help you make better decisions with planning your career and deciding which technology you should latch on to. Thanks so much for connecting to the Simplilearn channel. Do like us, do subscribe, do click on the bell icon so you're notified about new content that we put out, and do leave comments for us so that we can keep adding more content that interests you. Thank you.
Hi there, if you like this video, subscribe to the Simplilearn YouTube channel and click here to watch similar videos. To nerd up and get certified, click here.